Just before we begin with our energy panel, I just wanted to make a quick announcement that on Saturday, November 2nd, the Food and Agricultural Law Society will be hosting a brunch and a fundraiser for the South Royalton Community Garden. There will be 2 sittings of 25 people each for these for this student-hosted brunch, so please see the Falls table in Chase if you want to sign up for that. And without further ado, this is our energy panel.
Hi, I'm Genevieve Byrne. I'm a staff attorney with the Institute of Energy and the Environment here at the law school. I'm so excited that the VJEL theme this year is reconciling agriculture and environmentalism. And after this morning's sessions, it's so clear that these are issues that so many people in this room are really grappling with every day. Just over a year ago here at Vermont Law School, we started the Farm and Energy Initiative to research how law and policy can be used to transition the agricultural industry to be more energy efficient, reduce reliance on fossil fuels, expand access to sources of renewable energy, and manage land in a way that can reduce energy use, emissions, and the environmental impact of agriculture. When we talk about farmers as energy consumers and producers, we really aren't just talking about how much energy do farmers use to grow our food, which is, of course, a fuel itself that we consume about 3 times a day and some snacks. Farmers may also be growing energy crops for biofuels under federal subsidies, or serving as a site for utility-scale solar arrays that generate renewable electricity. Some farms are targeted as a source of intense methane emissions, and others are using regenerative agriculture to improve land use practices, carbon sequestration, and climate mitigation. Our panelists represent that diversity of work occurring in the farm and energy field, from advancing state and federal policy to criticizing systems that aren't working, understanding trade-offs in land use, developing renewable energy on farms, or using farm byproducts, and each working to reconcile environmentalism in energy in agriculture. So that brings us to our first panelist. I'm pleased to introduce Katherine Keske, who's the professor of environmental management at the University of California, Merced, as well as an adjunct professor at the Memorial University of Newfoundland. She received her PhD in agriculture and resource economics from Colorado State University. She's an applied economist and social scientist who works on complex research problems, including coupled natural and human systems. Her research has focused on food security and food sovereignty, waste management, conversion of biomass into energy and biochar, and California's policies on methane emissions reductions. So without further ado, Katherine Keske.
Thank you so much. Oh, good, this works. I thought I'd have the wireless because I like to roam. Oh, and I just, did I do something wrong there?
Excuse me.
Well, anyways, it's really nice to be in Vermont. It was 82 degrees in Fresno yesterday. University of California, Merced, just a real quick thing is, it's the 10th campus of the University of California. So most people have heard of our first campus, that's Berkeley. They've been around 150 years. Merced opened in California's Central Valley in 2005. And so many of our undergraduate students, their parents are the ones who are actually harvesting the crops from the citrus trees, and a lot of them are first-generation students. So that's a little bit about University of California, Merced. So I just wanted to make it really clear, I'm not here to tell you how it's done in California. But here's how climate change mitigation and greenhouse gas reduction is done in California. And that relates to the topic for today, which is waste management, on-farm energy opportunities, and agriculture. So this is a lot on the slide. This is Also going to be available, slide deck if anybody would like it. But the thing in California, so maybe when you woke up, you heard the headlines about fires in California, fires in California. That is going to be the normal, I'm told, from here on out. So greenhouse gas emission reduction is tied to climate change. Whoop, wow, that was crazy. Tied to climate change mitigation policies. So how all this connects with agriculture, California is recognizing that climate change and climate change mitigation is part of the reality, and we are living it with the wildfires. So climate change yields increased average temperatures, which yields longer fire seasons, more destructive fires, and increased liability. And so it's recognized at every single level of our government, from state down to county. And every county has a climate change action plan. And part of what makes that implementable is the, I'm going to say notorious, California Air Resources Board. I say notorious because the Air Resources Board, which sets the standards for emissions and greenhouse gas targets, sort of is defiant and very large and defiant in terms of saying to the federal legislation, well, here's the way we're going to do it. Now, recently, the federal exemption has come into question. But in any case, the CARB has set some global warming and legislation and enacted it over the last decade. So Assembly Bill 2006 established several climate change programs or climate programs. There's the Cap and Trade, Low Carbon Fuel Standard, Zero Emission Vehicle Program. California is on track to reduce black carbon emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. So we're on track for this. And as I mentioned, local government climate action plans map state to local resources to help farmers, to help citizens try to save money, but also it's tied to this reducing risk. And risk, a lot of it comes in the form of reducing fire risk. So here's some relevant items for our panel today. So Senate Bill 32, which was passed in 2014, and Assembly Bill 398, passed in 2017, really set these aggressive greenhouse gas targets. So greenhouse gas emissions are supposed to be 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And greenhouse gas emission reduction, 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Those are our targets, and again, it comes back to climate change, which takes the form of fires and other sea level rise, but really fires. Now, here's some victories. Greenhouse gas emissions per capita declined 23%, and total greenhouse gas emissions declined 10% since 2000. So we're keeping track of that. Now, I'm going to kind of drill down to a very specific greenhouse gas in California and also a specific sector, ag emissions in California. So here we have the x-axis here, 2000, 2008. This is supposed to be 2017. So this is the ag emissions in California. The crop growing and harvesting emissions, you can see it's declined over the past 2 decades. That's a great thing. However, unfortunately, livestock manure management and enteric fermentation, so what's enteric fermentation? Anybody? Gassy cows. Okay, has increased since 2000. And so that's the downside. So as a sector, even though total greenhouse gas emissions from the ag sector decreased in California, but methane emissions increased. So it's like a mixed message here, like it's a mixed victory. So unfortunately, in that, dairies are California's single largest contributor to methane emissions. So in general, while we're doing better with greenhouse gas emissions, methane, and specifically methane tied to dairies, has worsened. Okay, so why methane? Why am I picking on methane? And I'm not trying to like single out dairies. And I have to say my father's family, they are dairy farmers, so I love dairies. It's near and dear to my heart. But methane is a serious issue. Comparative impact, 25 times greenhouse gas warming potential compared to carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. So it comes to a question of how do you measure it? Well, how much is in the atmosphere? How long does the gas stay in the atmosphere? How strongly does the gas affect the atmosphere? So you'll see some variance. Some will say 18 to 30 times the greenhouse gas warming potential, but the message is it's a lot more of an impact than carbon dioxide, pound for pound. Methane comprised 10.2% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in 2017. Total methane emissions declined 10% since 1990, but during that same period, this shows how bad California's doing in this regard. They increased in California 19% since 2000. So as a state, we understand methane is a source, it's an Achilles heel. It's where we're not doing so well at, and it's a very potent greenhouse gas. So what can be done? Like now we know sort of we've isolated what's the problem. What are some of the opportunities? Okay, well, so here's some nice links if you're interested, and all the links in my presentation are clickable, but PG, and it should be PG&E, Biomethane Supply Quick Reference Guide, Southern California Gas. So I think a lot of my colleagues here will talk about methane and biomethane that can be converted from animal waste. You capture in an enclosed area the manure, and it can be converted into methane, which can be used as a biogas or through an electrical generator transformed into electricity. So I have a diagram on the next slide. I'm not sure if I'm going to have time to get to it, but here's the thing. It sounds really great, but is it economically feasible? So if you are, I had a chance to talk to some of the farmers here, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, because it's always so helpful. Is it economically feasible to use an anaerobic digester? And it really comes down to a case-by-case basis, and this is where some of my research has come into play. But I would say as a state, here's my perspective on California. Okay, California is aggressively moving to electrification. It's moving away from natural gas. It's moving towards electrification in part because we have a really large market for residential solar. So if you've gone to California recently, you've probably noticed, maybe compared to like 5 years ago, there's a lot of homes with solar panels, mine included. It's great in a lot of ways, but the downside is it makes biogas, anaerobic digestion type of operations, it makes them hard to compete with in an electrification market. The other thing is that we've got the state paying attention to other things, wildfire mitigation and revamping that infrastructure. So a lot of the money that might have been used to combat methane, instead it's focused on like trying to prevent fires, well, actually first put them out and then try to prevent them. But the state is providing funding for technological innovation for methane reduction. I'm on some very nice research grants that are actually looking at creating biomass from the agricultural products like almonds, shells or almond trimmings, pistachio shells, trimmings, et cetera, and converting that into biochar, which is like a charcoal, and using that for manure stabilization in the soils. So some of that work is funded by the state of California, and we're really hoping and optimistic that it will advance quickly once we've got the results from the field trials finished. Now, I think that the state will increase its farmer support for anaerobic digestion. It currently has some state funding, but I suspect that if they really want to tackle the methane problem by the years that they say they're going to, the state of California is going to have to provide some specific funding for farmers for anaerobic digestion units. I would also say this could be a deal breaker for dairies. California exceeded Wisconsin as the #1 producer of dairy products. I think this may have been in 2003 or 1993. I can't remember if it was last decade or the decade before. California exports a lot of its dairy. Now, good, bad, or what have you, it's open for dialogue, but the matter is that's the current state. And if the methane laws come into action, if California really wants to meet those targets, it could be a deal breaker for dairies. We see some dairies picking up, moving to other states. Idaho's been mentioned before today. Idaho's one such example. Maybe some of the dairies, maybe they'd relocate to Vermont. I'm not sure, but Idaho is frequently the area for relocation. So if we want to keep the dairies in California, and I would even say if you want to keep the dairies in Vermont, I think a breakthrough with anaerobic digestion or methane capture technology is critical. And the only way I see that happening, honestly, is through state or federal subsidized technology innovation programs. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. I won't talk about how a biomethane system works exactly, but you do get an idea of biogas is collected. It's either used as natural gas or it's converted into electricity. Okay. Here's some commonalities. This is where some of my research has come into plays. I've mostly done research with anaerobic digesters in the West. So unlike the East, in the West, we have low water. And a lot of times the waste ends up being high solids content. So it's low water. The management practices are different. We don't flush the manure. We tend to scrape it. It tends to be rocks and other things that collect. So it doesn't tend to be as economically feasible in the West compared to some operations perhaps in the East. But here are some commonalities of when it is successful and when it is economically feasible. So it's more economically feasible when the state law allows for net metering, so selling back the energy to the grid, so the farmer will have the opportunity to sell energy back to the power company. It's better when there's high energy prices, which is high opportunity cost. So low energy prices, it's hard to compete against, coal from Wyoming. That facilitates electricity generation. It's just hard to compete with that. It's more successful when there's plentiful water. I always say like a digester. I'm going to wrap it up because I am out of time. But a digester is like your belly. If you don't have enough water, you're not going to feel so well. The same thing with a digester. If a digester isn't properly watered, it kind of breaks down. Okay, so in summary, we're on good track with greenhouse gas reduction. There's incentive for the state to innovate, retain dairies. When California innovates, we benefit as a state, but we also view it as other states and other parts of the country benefit from our innovation. And I really hope that I can come back sometime and tell you about some of the success stories. Thanks. Here's my contact information.
So we're going to be sort of starting and ending with methane and anaerobic digestion, changing gears a little bit in the middle. Next, we'll be hearing from Katherine Oakes, who's the LLM Fellow for the Farm and Energy Initiative here at Vermont Law School. She earned her JD from Villanova Law School and worked as a public defender with the Defenders Association of Philadelphia for 3 years before joining the Farm and Energy Initiative in 2018. She is a lifelong advocate for ecological justice and systems thinking, and Katherine grounds her research in the civics of environmental stewardship, social justice, and democracy through grassroots-informed policy design. Here at the law school, Katherine directs our Healthy Soils Law Project at the Institute for Energy and the Environment.
So I'm going to talk to you about the demand side of agriculture, of energy in agriculture. To decarbonize our economy, we need to invest in agriculture and food systems that provide energy efficiency and food security. Towards this goal, no matter the solution that you believe in, It's critical to understand the role of federal policy in perpetuating industrial agriculture. So what I'm going to do today is briefly describe industrial agriculture, although it's been talked about a little bit this morning, so I might skip some of the details on that. And then I'll contrast it with farming systems that emphasize energy efficiency and resource conservation. I'll then give a few examples that illustrate how federal policy incentivizes energy-intensive agriculture and point to a few areas for reform. So industrial agriculture is the dominant food production system in the United States. It's characterized by large-scale monoculture, heavy use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, meat production and confined animal feeding operations, and heavy emphasis on a few crops that overwhelmingly end up as animal feed, biofuels, and things like high fructose corn syrup. It's increasingly consolidated and globalized, with the top 4 producers controlling over 50% of the market share. Production processes and business relationships resemble other industries more than the traditional agrarian ideal of small independent farms, the model which earlier eras of farm policy actually were based on. I'm going to skip a little bit more of the background for sake of time. So how does agriculture consume energy? It does it in 2 ways, directly through gasoline and diesel fuels, electricity and natural gas, and indirectly through energy-intensive inputs, primarily fertilizers and pesticides. The most energy-demanding aspect of modern intensive agriculture is nitrogen fertilizer, which has increased 7-fold since the 1960s and is 10 times more energy intensive to produce than the other 2 primary fertilizers, potassium and phosphorus fertilizers. So nitrogen fertilizer represents about half of agriculture's total energy use. Machinery is typically the second most important energy consumer in rain-fed crop production and is predominantly used for soil cultivation and harvesting processes. Land use. Commodity crops like corn, wheat, soybeans, and rice are more energy intensive to grow than traditional subsistence crops, probably due to changes in cropping strategies in response to global markets. These commodity crops cover over 80% of US cropland. They're also farm outputs that require additional processing and energy use to become products. While corn, for example, covers 90 million acres of US farmland and it receives the majority of federal farm subsidies, it's used primarily for ethanol and animal feed, with less than 10% used for human food, mostly, again, in the form of high fructose corn syrup-based products. It's an inefficient use of agricultural land, but ethanol is also very energy inefficient to produce. So research shows that there's no identifiable net energy yield from corn ethanol and just slightly more benefit from cellulosic ethanol. Intensive livestock production involves more energy use than crop production due to inefficiencies inherent in biological feed conversion and to the higher energy demands of creating fat and protein molecules. Animal feed overwhelmingly accounts for the energy use associated with livestock production. Okay, so that's industrial agriculture. Agriculture that conserves energy. The opposite of an industrial system is a biological one that maximizes the transformation of solar energy and other resources into useful products, ideally edible ones. This means less dependence on fossil fuels and chemical inputs, resource efficiency, system resiliency, and soil health and diversity. Healthy soil is rich in organic content, which means it's energy rich, and thus a valuable resource that provides nutrients and energy for productive and high-quality plant growth, reducing the need for energy and chemical inputs, as well as a host of other benefits. The use of nitrogen fertilizer is reduced in these systems by synchronizing its application with plant needs, using optimal application techniques that reduce nitrogen losses, improving nitrogen cycling, for example, with manures and residues, and expanding reliance on biological nitrogen fixation, for example, through legumes. No-till crop production is a significant part of reducing agricultural energy use as well, mainly by reducing the reliance on machinery and reducing the use of chemicals. Studies show energy consumption for conservation or just conventional tillage is significantly higher than for no-till. I'll skip some of the numbers just for time's sake, but anyway. These systems strive for energy productivity, which is the relationship between energy inputs and yields, rather than industrial systems which focus solely on production. Crops are grown that are highly productive and require low inputs, but simultaneously deliver valued nutrients. This could mean growing seasonal crops, for example, or crops best suited to a landscape. Measures to improve environmental performance in crop production systems have been shown to increase yields by 79 to 200% in some cases, with similar studies showing that agro-ecosystem productivity increases with more efficient use of the biotic energy embedded in biomass and also using less energy inputs. So that's very interesting because there's been a lot of talk today about how farming is not necessarily at odds with stewardship, and in fact, production and stewardship can go hand in hand. So how does federal policy incentivize industrial agriculture and intensive energy use? There are so many examples, I for sake of time, have to just pick a couple, so I'm gonna focus on two big ones. One is a Farm Bill example and one's an energy policy example. So federal agricultural policy has long emphasized overproduction, consolidation, government subsidies that favor certain crops, and meanwhile discourages systems that conserve energy, soil, and water. My first example is federal crop insurance, which is authorized through the Farm Bill and provides subsidized insurance policies to manage risk of yield losses and revenue loss from droughts, floods, and other damage from causes like diseases and pests. While the program covers losses for 130 crops, only 4 major crops, corn, cotton, soybean, and wheat, account for over 70% of enrolled acreage. With unlimited insurance subsidies, crop insurance encourages consolidation by providing a competitive advantage to the nation's largest farms at the expense of small, mid-sized, and beginning farmers. For example, the top 10% of farms, based on crop sales, receive 70% of subsidies, and the top 2% receive 30% of subsidies, as well as a much more lucrative rate at $50 an acre versus the average, which is $12.50 an acre. The federal government pays 65% of these insurance premiums. So the program discourages conservation activities, failing to account for the risk reduction, which Katherine mentioned, associated with different approaches to farming. The 2018 Farm Bill did revise crop insurance a little bit, so it now allows, you can still be eligible if you decide to do cover cropping, for example. But the bill did decline to include many other conservation activities that had been included in earlier drafts and proposals. The 2018 bill also rejected a provision that was proposed to encourage performance-based insurance premium discounts for adoption of advanced conservation systems. As many farmers rely on crop insurance, these types of provisions further discourage innovation. So in this way, with a brief description, federal policy dictates what farmers grow and how they do it. Second example is the Renewable Fuel Standard. Congress created the Renewable Fuel Standard program. It was authorized under the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and then expanded under the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. Its purpose was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and expand the nation's renewable fuels sector while reducing reliance on imported oil. The program sets a mandate for a certain amount of transportation fuel to come from biofuels, basically. So agriculture plays an important role in achieving the RFS goals, since corn is the primary feedstock for conventional ethanol and soybeans is the conventional stock for biodiesel. As a result of the mandate for cellulosic biofuel production from agricultural residues and dedicated energy crops, acreage of corn has increased by 1/3 since the 1990s. Federal incentives for ethanol production can also be found all through the energy title of the Farm Bill and tax legislation. So I won't go into all the different legislative components to it, but biomass production uses energy. It also uses fertilizer, pesticides as inputs, and direct fuel use, which in addition to the already inefficient energy conversion rate that I mentioned earlier of corn to ethanol, makes for a very inefficient process, not to mention use of land. Critics also point to the expansion of energy crop production onto environmentally fragile lands. Scientist Ratan Lal, who is well known at Ohio State University for his research on carbon sequestration, and particularly soil carbon, has pointed out that the effectiveness of no-till requires mulching with crop residues, for which, of course, there are competing end uses such as not only livestock feed, but now fuel. A couple other little examples that I won't go into, but I'll just mention to show you kind of the scope of where policies, okay, I'm gonna skip that, I don't have time. But there are plenty of other examples. You can ask me later. So just to wrap up, from the perspective of energy efficiency, the central objective of crop production is to maximize the transformation of solar energy and other resources into useful, ideally edible products. In the industrial model, maximizing productivity has been facilitated by fertilizers, irrigation, tillage, pesticides, all underpinned by industrial fossil fuel-based energy. Research shows that industrial agriculture is actually not the most efficient means of energy conversion in agriculture, nor is it maximizing the use of land and other resources to meet the needs of a growing population. I'm almost done. So research shows, again, that there are actually viable alternatives towards which we should be directing our public investment. Key levers for progress, just to end on a positive note. State and local opportunities to help bear risk of innovation and transition, to fill the gap left by federal policies that effectively lock farmers into a system of monoculture and overproduction. Second, fund research on where economies of scale realize diminishing returns. 3, fund and reward innovators and practitioners of things like regenerative farming. 4, design policies around the acknowledgement that soil itself is a natural resource that is necessary for plant growth and decarbonization. And finally, mostly, I think that we need policies that remember that good farming is conservation and stewardship, and that we need policies that inspire economies that reflect that value.
Thank you, Katherine. Next, we have Jimmy Daukas, who directs the work that American Farmland Trust does in helping farmers, ranchers, and landowners reduce greenhouse gas emissions, sequester carbon, expand renewable energy, and adapt to a changing climate. Jimmy earned a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Middlebury College and a Master's of Business Administration and a Master's of Public Management, so many degrees, Jimmy, from the University of Maryland. And he's a steering committee member for the Coalition on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. During his more than 20 years at American Farmland Trust, he has played a key role in national policy campaigns, served as a senior manager in programming, communications, and development.
So do you load that up?
Oh, yes, sir.
So I'm going to try to cover a lot of material quickly. I'm going to focus on solar siting on ag lands, and although some of this I'll get to skip through because you heard John talk a little bit about American Farmland Trust and also a little bit about the issues of competition for land. On a personal note, and to me, this is one of the things that success looks like in this area. Last year, I invested in or I should say our family invested in a community solar program down in Maryland because the law changed. And we now have our energy coming from a solar panels on top of an old landfill in the next county over. And so that kind of project sounds really, really great. I'm so happy to be in a state that encouraged that and changed the laws to do that. And I wish there were more of those, and maybe trying to figure out where some of the, and maybe fewer of some of the projects that might be on our prime farmland. Does that do that? You want? Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead. These were going to be context, but I think John set it up for climate and agriculture. He talked a little bit about the competition for land and the study that we did, 1.5 million acres lost per year. So if we hold here for a second. So it's not just, and John mentioned it, but it's not just traditional sprawl, right? There's, that's threatening our land. And also I want to talk about the demand for our ag lands. So it's fragmenting ag land. One of the things that we found out is that it's not just your typical urban sprawl, but actually when we really look at it, we've lost some of the ag land because of low density rural sprawl. And that's taking land out of production. And in fact, we didn't really realize it before because some of the data wasn't capturing that. So you get the fragmentation of land, especially out west, that makes it non-viable for agriculture. Other things that are going to be increasing the competition for land are just energy infrastructure. There's a lot of debate about natural gas pipelines, and if you're near one, you know about it because there's a lot of advocacy around that. And then also just the climate impact as we project out and as water and temperature changes, and the sort of productivity of that land is another sort of competition for land, maybe not, but an impact. But it goes beyond that because now we're into a demand for that land, as John said, for carbon sequestration and reforestation. Most of the time when you're hearing all those natural and working lands climate solutions, it's often on reforestation. That reforestation's on ag land. New England has a New England food vision. New England would like to, or at least some advocates would like to have more agricultural land to try to look for, to try to build regional food systems. So actually we need probably more acres in order to build up and have a higher percentage of our of our food coming regionally, and that reduces vehicle miles and things. And then lastly, expanding clean renewable energy. That's a demand for our ag lands. And let me just take one, I'm just going to follow off of Katherine's. So we already use ag land a lot for energy, right? So a third of all the corn, somewhere between 30 and 35 million acres, goes to energy production. We don't sort of call it that, right? Because it's ethanol and it's corn and we think about it that way. But if you look at the effectiveness, and Emily Cole on our staff ran some numbers, but if you look at the effectiveness, the energy effectiveness per acre, solar might be 12 or more times more effective at producing energy. If we're doing ethanol for cars and energy for electric cars, that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And if you ran all the energy, or that is, if you had solar on all of those ethanol energies, that would more than produce electricity to match total U.S. electricity consumption. So a perspective as we think about how we talk about and think about the, yeah. All right, I think many of you know solar energy in the context of climate. We have very aggressive state goals on climate change. Those lead to very aggressive goals on renewable energy. And so that's driving a need for dramatic increases of solar in virtually every single state across the country. Again, a study by Acadia and their 2030 energy vision said New England would need to increase its solar 12-fold. Okay, so that's part of that demand. All right, next. Thank you for doing it. I just wanted 2 points to start off. This is a really big deal from economic viability for farmers and for landowners, right? It starts, we heard a lot this morning about the challenges with income diversification and ag viability. So this is a big deal because it's worth a lot of money per acre, right? At AFT, we want to be supportive of that. As Nathan talked about keeping farmers on the land, and John Piatti talked about it, that part of our mission, ag economic viability, is critically important. How do we do that in a way where we also do the beginning part of our mission, which is to protect ag lands, is part of this whole, that's part of the whole balance. The second point I want to make, and it often just isn't raised, is that there are a lot of equity considerations in the solar energy area, and a project that I'll mention that AFT is part of it here in New England. We did a lot of interviews to start it off, and there was a lot of discussion about equity issues and raising those and saying that they're often overlooked. And so some of the things that people raised is that solar is really, really important, and it's an important economic opportunity for low-income communities and historically disadvantaged communities, but there's real challenges for them to be involved in it and to get engaged in it. So community engagement early on with those communities, right, including to help build trust, community benefits, clarity on what are the benefits for them, for everyone to understand the issues, the information so that it's available for the community to understand and engage. And then there are just some issues, not just rural, urban, but actually within. Where does it go, and does a low-income community get to benefit from it? And then also, are you getting siting in their community, because it's a little bit of a NIMBY, but they get a giant solar facility, but they're not getting the benefit. So I just want to raise that issue because it often isn't at the beginning of the discussion, and it should be. Okay, so really, we believe that there's some unintended consequences. So we really want to do this, right? We think that there's a high demand for solar. We need to deal with it. Ag land looks good. It's flat. It's drained. It's well set up for it. You need economic viability for farmers, but there can be unintended consequences if we don't do it in a thoughtful way that's planned out. So AFT, as an organization, doesn't believe that we ought to be putting our solar panels on our best ag land. It just doesn't seem like it makes sense for the sustainability and the sustainable future that we need to move forward. A caution here is we just don't know that much. We don't really fully understand the land use implications and what land is going into some of these kind of projects. And so there's just a need for a lot more both data, analysis, and understanding. Next. So solar policy. Solar policy, that was part of our the panel's question, is how policies can give farmers incentives to become more sustainable in energy, produce energy, and then I'd like to add, and still continue being farmers, right? Because if you sold out, that would be maybe good for some energy production, but not necessarily what we're actually looking for. So solar policy can reduce and avoid conflicts, right? If you can have that kind of discussion up front, have some common ground, then that can lead to reductions, right? There's been a lot of tension. You've seen it in the headlines. It can accelerate renewable development because there have been moratoria, like especially in New York, holding back the production because of these kinds of questions and uncertainty and tensions. It also can protect the best farmland and our most natural lands, and then also realize economic opportunities for all. Is that a note for me? No. Next. Oh, it's not. Oh, that's me not realizing it does that. So what does it do? So we believe that smart solar siting policies can maximize the potential for solar while minimizing the impact on the most productive. It guides siting to preferred areas or away from areas that we would like to protect. It also thinks about protecting the land for future farming, right? How you actually do it, and what do we think about in decommissioning some of that other stuff. It encourages solar and farming. We'll talk a little bit about that if I have time, for dual use. And then it integrates it into planning and policies at the state and local level, which is really critical, because right now we don't have that. So next is, I just want to mention, because some of the things I'm going to talk about are drawn from this New England Smart Solar Siting Partnership Project, where several of us have gotten together. Clean energy groups, American Farmland Trust, Conservation Law Foundation, Vote Solar, Acadia, and also the Vermont Law School as a multi-stakeholder project to try to address some of these issues in New England and do some of the research and analysis to help inform these discussions. It is funded by the John Merck Fund and the Barr Foundation, and we want to thank them for that. Let's go to the next one. So, some of those activities that we're going to try to do, but that we've also identified can help in the process, right? These are activities, before you go into an actual policy, these are activities that people can help. So convening stakeholders, developing shared principles, data analysis to inform the decisions, mapping with stakeholders to try to identify least conflict areas, because there's enough land, it's just a question of where does it go? And if it goes on our best land, bad solution, but we can figure out where it could go on some other lands. Let's go to the next. Go ahead and put those in there. So here's the, so I'm not going to be able to go into the detail of this, but let me just say that, so for solar policy, it really is a mix of strategies, okay? There are different kinds of policy elements, like permitting and a whole host of those issues, a whole bunch of different siting issues, a whole bunch of different design issues, right? And then we also have policy levers in terms of requirements that we might have and qualifications, expediting the process, creating incentives. Having authorities, taxes, mitigation, and other kinds of considerations. And then lastly, we have different kinds of projects, size, location, type. It is a mix of those across the policies that states and localities need to use to try to address these issues. And really, they have a continuum of options. And so we might have something, an example is, a Department of Agriculture being aware of a project, or a Department of Agriculture having to weigh in and approve, right? So they have a continuum across all those. I am going to hold off on the rest. I wanted to go into a couple of examples, like defining what is the ag land, and dual use, which is agriculture and solar on the same acre, right? Not just co-located, but on the same acre, which has a lot of potential, but needs a lot of research. And then the third thing, which I think is important, but again, don't have time to go into, is just the whole soil health side of things, how you do a project and how we talk about decommissioning it will have an effect on whether whether that land is available for agriculture in the future. Thank you very much. No stories.
Next, we have Bill Jorgenson from Vanguard Renewable Energy, and Bill says he'll do his own introduction.
See, when you get to be ancient, you really don't want them to go through all that stuff. Okay? So I've been involved in the food industry, et cetera, for years and years. We'll get this up here. What we're doing now is that we're developers. We put together money, farmers, and anaerobic digesters, basically making renewable energy. And what's happened is that as a result of all of that, we get involved. Go on to the next one. We get involved in a ton of things. We have to deal with the utilities. We have to deal with the regulators. We have to deal with ag. We have to deal with food. Okay, and then when we're all done, We have to have investors who can make money. Now, as I said, I'm ancient, okay? I've run a lot of businesses. This is the only one where you have 5 industries that you have to all line up who never talk to each other. So in order to accomplish this goal, you've got to establish some ground rules fairly quickly. There are no ground rules. Nate was part of what started in my journey 11 years ago when I took my first retirement. I'm in my second now and about to go into my third. And we were starting in Massachusetts, okay, which had nothing in the rules or regulations about biogas. It wasn't there. We had nothing in the construction code about how you built a plant, much less built it on a farm. And we had a Department of Agriculture that said, what the hell are you doing? Okay, because how does that tie in to agriculture? So we had to build it basically from scratch. It took 3.5 years to do what I thought would take a year. We had no money, okay? We were given a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there. We got a few grants and things like that. And we started a business, and there was myself and 5 farmers. And we built 2 digesters, picky little itty-bitty digesters. You can still see them, okay? They're still operating. They're part of what is now Vanguard, which has rolled up into a group of institutional investors because some billionaires came along and said, you know, that's not a bad business plan. So we will, because we are billionaires who believe in climate change, we will give you money to go out and expand from those 2 little itty-bitty digesters, and everything will be fine. I thought, oh, great, we're going to have $100 million, and it's not going to be a problem. It is nothing but a problem, okay, because there are no 2 states that have the same requirements. Okay, so no matter what you do, and where we had no requirements in Massachusetts, we started the first organics ban, okay, we had the first net metering that went into it, and so on and so forth. Even though we had those, we have to replicate them. Now we have our first project here in Vermont, okay, which, as you well know, is led by Vermont Gas, okay, and by the university, okay, who are buying gas made on the Goodrich farm, which is up in Salisbury, okay, which in another year, more or less, okay, you can all go and visit. And that is going to produce enough gas, okay, to take care of something on the order of 7,000 to 10,000 homes or 50,000 vehicles from 900 cows and a bunch of organic material. So the next one. These, you can read all these things later. This is the group of people who join with us. That's our investors. CoBank, the Farm Credit System, and then DFA, which is the Dairy Farmers of America. We have a strategic partnership with them, and I've dealt with them for 2 decades, and also with Agrimark. Now, let's go to the next one. That's perfect. That digester in the middle, okay, is nothing more than a mechanical cow's stomach. So you have to figure out, because it's a biological process, and I worked many years for the Quaker Oats Company. It was easy to make Quaker Oats. And there were like 50 guys at least who, if something went wrong, they could come and help us fix whatever went wrong. When you're doing an anaerobic digester, there are maybe 5 guys in the United States who know half of what goes wrong, and the other half says, I never saw that before, I have no idea. Okay, so you're essentially writing the book as you go through this. And the farms are a partner to that whole thing of writing the book. And frankly, if you didn't have farmers as a partner, they would have long ago left the investment. Because farmers have a mentality that is, if something is broken, I need to fix it. And if the guy next door or my mechanic can't fix it, I've got to fix it myself. So with that mentality, okay, we had a great partnership. And now we're in the business of taking manure and feed scraps, sometimes, depends on which state. We put them together, we put them into a digester, and we make either electricity or natural gas out of it. Until 1 year ago, there was no uniform standard of how you put natural gas into a pipeline. So every utility now, mind you, not state, utility, which means you have multiple numbers in a given state, would set its own standard for how we were going to have to make a product to put it into the pipeline. We raised the net income of farmers by 15 to 20% by being part of what we do. We're paying farmers in New Mexico, where I'll be on Monday, $50 a cow in a partnership, and then a percentage of what they're going to get by when we go and sell renewable natural gas. So it's created a whole sense of new products for the agricultural community to get involved in. And whereas we begged, borrowed, and stole for money before, today, in the last 6 months, into our office that has a massive number of people, 17, okay? It's a startup, all right? There's been people come into our office and offer us $1.2 billion to invest in making renewable natural gas into the future. There have been 3 of the 5 largest utilities in the United States that found their way to 17 people. There have been 2 of the largest petroleum companies that have decided they're going to get there. But then when I tell them how much it's going to cost them to get this renewable natural gas, all 8 of them left, okay? Because they said, my God, you can't pay that much more for it. And I said, no, look. And we took them through all the economics. We said, here's the P&L, here's the pro forma. No other business gives away its pro forma, because everybody thinks you can copy it. Quite frankly, if any of you can figure out our pro forma, go ahead and copy it, okay? Because that's not the secret. Okay, the secret has to be how you put together all of these things and how you become an integral part of the farm and allow the farm to be able to create a whole new business. And as well, the farmer reduces by 60% the amount of chemical fertilizers that he uses on his property. Because the byproduct of this is a natural fertilizer, okay, that is higher in nitrogen quality, which means that it uptakes quicker into the plant and it increases the yield in corn and hay. So the farmer gets a certain amount of money in cash, and he gets an improvement in what he's doing, and from an environmental standpoint, he reduces the amount of chemicals that he uses. So part of this whole energy meets agriculture, okay, we can go on. Energy meets agriculture next. Okay, forget that, that's New Mexico, and I'll tell you about it later. These are the standards, okay, that you have to look for. You heard about California. Quite frankly, the thing that will lure investment and bankers to coming to help the farmers and everybody else are standards. The California Air Board is certainly an arrogant group of people. I will give you no doubt about that, okay? And the way that they do things is anything but simple. Okay, and I will give them that, because you have to hire a consultant to come with you so you understand what the hell they're talking about, okay? But that standard of being able to create what is a carbon efficiency, or a CI score, as it's called, is a perfectly good way of analyzing every kind of way that you can make renewable natural gas and give it a scorecard. What does the scorecard tell you? The scorecard tells you how much you can reduce the greenhouse gases by each one of those. So if you take natural gas, that's more or less at about 70. If you take gas made on a farm, the score is minus 220. A minus score in this case is very, very good, contrary to your grades, okay? So if you look at it this way, you're saying to yourself, the best way, short of hogs, in the United States to make renewable natural gas is on dairy farms. So that's why you have all the people coming and saying, well, let's invest in that. And there's going to be a huge investment go into the agricultural community. But believe me, everybody is well set against it happening. So first, you got to accept the standard, California Air Board. Second is the CAFO regulations, which come through the USDA, okay? They all say it's a national standard, hogwash, okay? No state does it the same. As a matter of fact, within a state, 3 guys do it differently. So cut it out. Make it all be the same, okay, so that we can then set a standard and the farmers can know what the standard is, and we will reduce the problems with nitrogen, phosphorus, and every other overload that you want. I'm going to come back to that one in a second. The utilities, I talked about them. Okay, we have to get them to a standard. The reason I was late getting up here is I had to go to a thing for the utility, and there was National Grid. I shouldn't have said their name, but it was an unnamed utility, okay? And their CEO and their technology officer was talking about how accommodating they are, okay, for being a partner. We're partners with them. It has taken them 2 years to decide how much they're going to charge me to sell me gas. By the way, that's the business they're in, okay? But because we wanted to do it from a pipeline that runs across the farm, and we said, we're gonna bring it in, and then we're gonna send it back out into your pipeline again. Oh my goodness gracious sakes alive. Engineering studies, you know, da-da-da-da. So the utilities have got to get together and say, yes, we're gonna do this, and we want to do this because it's a good thing for our business, and so forth. Vermont Gas was the first utility in the United States to introduce a tariff where you can go buy, and you can today if you're a business, I'm not sure you can do it residentially yet, but as a business, you can buy renewable natural gas. And you had to get a tariff to do that. It took them 2.5 years to get a tariff to allow you to pay a premium price for something that they were going to make. That makes no sense. Okay, set the standard, let everybody do it, and let them sell it, and off we go. Next. So that's carbon intensity. Okay, go on. We won't with. These are the market movers. Greenhouse gas reduction, carbon neutral. We're working with the farms to become carbon neutral. And then have the utilities go in and do what Vermont Natural Gas has happened. And by the way, those are the states down below that in the last 5 months have all going to equal what you're doing. And when they call us to ask us how it should be done, we said, please just do what Vermont has done. Thank you very much. And we can all be fine. Okay, the next one. The next one, is there a next one? Yes, okay. We can reduce water. There is a process, which actually the first commercial one is going to be put on the Goodrich's farm here, okay, in Massachusetts. We will be able to reduce the amount of water that comes off of the farm by 60%. And then we can reuse that water and send it back again. In the southern part of the United States, where they use pivots to put out that water, we can give them cleaner water, better nutrition, and be able to resurface or recirculate all of that water that comes out of a dairy farm. So the farm can become an enormous ecological benefit, particularly in the western part of the country, where water is a problem. And then these are other things on here, which is that it's high time that somebody starts to recognize that you're going to have to pay for this somehow. So in the rate base that utilities use, the ag community and the utility community have got to get together and say there'll be a series of incentives. If you deliver me lower greenhouse gas, if you deliver me better energy, and if you lower the water, that I will give you an incentive to do that. Otherwise, I'm going to charge you 5 times what you're paying today for natural gas. Because otherwise, I have no investors who will put up that $1 billion+ dollars. That's the way the system works. So that's the real world, and that's what I live every day.
Thank you, and we'll open the floor to questions. Microphones?
Okay, this is for the last speaker. My question is this. In your mind, how would you want the structure to be? Let me rephrase that. You talked about the lack of structure nationally from putting gas into the pipeline. And you also mentioned towards the end that there's also issues with water usage or access to water. So in your mind, what is it, or how would that structure look for the federal government to do that? And also, in your mind, where should the states have their domain? How would that structure look so that you can have this fruitful investment climate that you're talking about, or that's necessary to kind of push this forward?
Okay. Well, there's just two things here. Number one, going into my mind is a very dangerous place. So let's just go with that. The second thing is I'll apologize to Senator Leahy and his staff in advance if I say I'm really not worried about the federal government. Because aside from a couple of things in there, like I said, the CAFO standards and other things, which is already part of the federal standard, and to move gas across interstate lines is part of the federal government standards, okay, we really want the states to adopt the standards, because then we can move much faster. So because the states have a reason to want to do it. Number one, they're committed to agriculture. Number two, they're committed to economic development. And number three, they all really want to reduce, that's at least 28 of the states. So I'll just take 28 and forget the others, okay, to be able to invest in. And they'll set up a standard for greenhouse gas reductions. So that's all I need. A standard, greenhouse gas reductions by such and such a date. So you got to do it so a market will exist. Okay, I get the standards for putting gas into it. All of the utilities in New York, led by National Grid, now I should be nice to them. Okay, so on that side, they've all agreed to one standard now for the state. It took us 2 years to get there, but there's now one standard throughout all of the utilities in New York. So those kinds of things, just having that environment set, okay, will work better for the investors. Does that answer your question, hopefully? Okay.
All right, I guess I'll grab the mic first. Yeah, so I live nearby. This is rural Vermont. There's a lot of people in small towns around here, energy committees, interested in renewable energy, whether it's biodigesters and maybe more so for solar. We've just witnessed the shutdown of one of the larger biodigesters in the state up at Vermont Technical College. I think that cost the state a little over $4 million. It's unfortunate. I'm sure there's a lot of backstory as to why that couldn't maintain itself. So let's move to small-scale renewables on farmland, not prime ag land that are owned either by the community or within the state. Is that viable in the state of Vermont on farmland, small biodigesters, 30 to 50 kilowatt solar arrays, or we have a long way to go?
I'm going to see if others. I don't know enough about Vermont and the economics of that, but my understanding is yes, and there are those kinds of projects springing up. But I also defer to Jen or Nate if they know more about the actual rates in Vermont for the size of projects that you're talking about.
So I would say that small-scale digesters are something that I struggle with, honestly. I think the idea sounds really good, and that the scale issue becomes really difficult in terms of operation and maintenance and feedstock reliability. When you talk about the Vermont Tech Digester, which I'm not entirely sure is in fact going to shut down, I think that the articles that came out about the shutdown have sort of collected some more feedstocks and they have additional people dropping off organics. Feedstock reliability has been one of their biggest problems, making sure they have consistent fuel to keep their digester operating. And so I think when we try to cite tiny little projects on a bunch of little farms, we're actually creating additional competition for a lot of those organic wastes. We're being intentional about it, about a community digester, something like Vermont Tech, where then you have a sort of great system set up to then go collect, take a truck around, go have people have a central drop-off location so that you don't end up investing in this infrastructure in a bunch of different little places that then ends up all in competition with one another. And then you're also going to be paying for however you're using the biogas. So at Vermont Tech, they do electricity generation. I think they have a code generation unit that they don't currently utilize the heat for right now, but could. And so, again, in each individual little place, you're also going to be making that investment in the sort of use of the biogas infrastructure. When it comes to small-scale solar, absolutely. Vermont has good policies. We have a good net metering policy. We have very interesting preferred siting policies that address some of the farmland issues that Jimmy brought up. I think one of the bigger issues in Vermont with solar is about the treatment of the renewable energy credits or renewable energy certificates, where right now there's an enormous financial incentive to send those RECs to the utility, which means that the people generating that solar energy are not in fact generating the solar energy, right? The utility is using that solar energy. And there's actually a financial disincentive to keep those RECs bundled with the electricity itself, where the farmer or the community solar project or whoever it is investing in that solar array is in fact using solar energy when it's all said and done.
I'll give you afterwards. There's a small company out in Oregon that is just testing some kinds of size of digesters on a small scale that would work in a community, could work in a community. I don't know whether it will or not, but for a variety of reasons. But that's coming along, but it's very nascent in terms of its development. The other issue that you have, whether it's solar or whether you're dealing with the digester, is if you want to reuse that power, so you want to reuse it in the community, you have to hook up to the grid, okay? Depending upon where you are, what the state of the lines are, what the state of the substation is, I can tell you that we're now paying $1.5 million to hook up any one of our digesters, i.e. to put it onto the line. So it's a very expensive proposition. So that has to come into the effect.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the expense, because I think the legislation that came into effect a couple of years ago regarding smaller solar, community solar projects has made it much more onerous and expensive for communities to develop that. I know the law school, the clinic, is involved now for probably 5 years in attempting to get a 30 kilowatt array, but based on a farm, actually, on not prime ag land. And the expense, I mean, we're getting a lot of volunteer hours. Thank you, law students, for your volunteer hours on that. But it's been kind of moving in the reverse direction here in this state as far as smaller scale. So Jimmy, if you can get right on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, Bill, I have a question for you, and I've watched the project, the Goodrich, from pretty close. I live not far away, but I also worked with the Goodrich family on their conservation deal, and obviously we got to a yes in terms of building the digester. But my question is, what changed? Because I know there was some bumps along the road. Was there policy changes and things that got you on board? Because they first started down the road for the digester. It looked like everything was going to go fine, and obviously you're maybe a group of investors, but were there other policy changes that said this could actually go? Because I know there was a cooling off period for maybe a year or so before you got involved. So if you could just speak to that.
You're absolutely correct. Yeah, there were three things that happened, okay? And they were set up before we acquired that project. Some people came and asked us to finish it. The first was Middlebury College and the trustees agreed to a 20-year contract to buy the gas. So that was a huge, huge difference. In other words, for investors to invest their money, there has to be a market. And so they signed up for a $40 million 20-year contract. So the investors know that somebody's going to pay for the gas. So that took care of 70%. And then Vermont Gas, through what I said that the regulators allowed them to do and be able to sell it, they are buying the other 30% and then marketing it in the state. So that was probably the largest single one. In terms of the permitting process and so forth that we had to go through and so forth, thanks to many of the agencies in Vermont, okay, we were able to, since they'd already gone through, there's a something or other number of, which is called the whatever process you go through to get the approval, okay, and they allowed us to basically just alter that to fit the design of what we were doing, as opposed to spend 2.5 years to go back through it. So we only had to spend a year to go through it. So they did cut it down from 2.5 years to a year by doing that, and that allowed us to get going. And the other thing is that family is incredibly resilient and enormously patient. So they made for very good partners.
Bill, I'd love to ask a question, a follow-up question on the scale side of it.
That's not fair.
You and I You alluded to some of the early work that we did together, trying to really put these ideas out there and get farmers interested. And one of our roadblocks was that there's actually hundreds of these small-scale digesters all across New England. Most of them ran for 5 years and then were shut down and never touched again by the farmer. And so it was hard to get them interested. What in your model was different that really enticed the farmers to give these things another try? And why are they still running 5 years after they were started when there's hundreds of smaller scale ones out there that just stopped?
That's a fair question. When we had our first meeting of the farmers in Massachusetts, and I told them, farmers are fantastic because they all know that they can fix something. They also all believe they know the best piece of equipment there is, and no two of them agree. So what I told them was, I said, the only way this is going to be successful is that we are going to design this on one design, we're going to do it one way, and we're going to run it, and you're going to milk cows. So we set up a management company to run it. They obviously get a piece of it. We are obviously very close to them because we handle their manure every day and everything else. And I told them they couldn't change a damn thing. And basically, okay, that's what happened. Now, I had to cajole them and I had to convince them. Okay, so that only took a year and a half. But when we got done with it, all 5 of them said, yes, that's the way we're going to do it. And the oldest digester is now 9 years old on Randy's farm and still running. And as a matter of fact, he was so happy with it, we just opened a second one on his second farm 2 months ago. So that model does work for getting farmers back. And within the last 4 months, I've signed 22 farms in 5 states up to the same model with the utility as a partner. So it can be done. It just takes a little bit of time, patience, and money.
Hi. Any words on how to best use biogas to mitigate our stranded asset risk with our current natural gas infrastructure?
Why do I get all these questions? I just asked the panel why I got all these questions. Okay. Wow. All right. You can use the biogas here to mitigate things. I'm going to be horribly simple, okay? If you buy 1 unit of renewable natural gas produced on a dairy farm, you can retire the greenhouse gas emissions from 5 units equals 1. So 1 unit of renewable natural gas retires 5 units of regular fossil natural gas. So therefore, if you bought 20% renewable natural gas from a dairy farm, you would be carbon neutral with whatever your load was. Now, the question is, can you do that? Can you get enough? I mean, because the numbers become huge. What we produce off a farm isn't, gigantic in the world of gas, okay? But that's the way you can do it. And we're negotiating with a couple of companies, okay, one in this state, actually, okay, to be able to do that in their factories. And so they're trying to figure out, how we can do that. It becomes an expense. Middlebury wrote a check for $40 million. That's public knowledge. Okay, and I told you it was for 20 years. So that's what they're spending in order to be carbon neutral. So it doesn't come for free, but that's how you can do it. And the balance comes from using CARB, the system, the CI score, and that's how you know that you can then provide the metric to show that you have, in fact, gotten to that point by the mitigation.
Looks like we're out of, can you do one more?
One more quick question.
One more question.
Sorry, it should be quick, and I promise it's on solar. So, just out of curiosity, I work with a lot of farmers who are seeking resources, and sometimes the ones that my organization provides, sometimes not. And we've received a lot of requests. How do I get solar on my property? And I'm just curious, how would a farmer get started with that? Who would they call?
Here in Vermont, I think,
Yeah.
contacting the Department of Ag. I mean, there's good resources on the website and that describe some of the things and describe how dual solar works and how it might be in some of the projects. So I would start there. I think that's the best place. And then you're going to have to sort of figure out who might locally come out and actually help you. But I think that's the connection and the network.
I think we're out of time for questions. I'm sorry. Thank you. Can we give a